Well, thank you for so much for doing this. You know, we just did a two-part series on infrastructure in the Highlands, and I know I should introduce you, of course, as a professor of civil engineering at Duke University, a native of Brooklyn, New York, grew up in Queens and Brooklyn. And I had mentioned to you earlier, you'll appreciate that we're located in Cold Spring, about halfway between the Tappan Zee Bridge and the walkway over the Hudson, each of which has a chapter in your book, The Road Taken. Your 19th book. I was going to kind of read a list of some of the books, but I thought that might take up the entire half hour because you've written so many books. I have a number of them. I have The History of the Toothpick, The History of the Bookshelf. I don't have your first book, The Engineering, To Engineer is Human, which you talk about the importance of failure. I don't have The Pencil History or The Bridge Builders, Engineers on Dreams. So there's a long list of great ways that you've taken engineering and I think made it easy for people to understand where it may be intimidating, much like the word infrastructure. And I think what strikes me as we reported this, I gave a copy of your book to every reporter to kind of get the background of what we're talking about. And what strikes me is we've been talking about infrastructure, you know, it was talked about 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago, and only now it's gotten to where they maybe send a lot of money. But I'm curious what you think the biggest obstacle is to having these big projects that we saw, you know, in the 50s or the 20s with the highways and that kind of thing happen, or is this money just going to end up being more maintenance or wasted or that kind of thing? I mean, what's keeping these grand infrastructure projects from happening?
Well, as far as how the money is spent, if the money is restricted, it should be spent that way. There tends to be a great deal of optimism about what can be done and what can't be done. You mentioned the Tappan Zee Bridge, for example. That was supposed to be one of the shovel-ready projects. There was a lot of hype about that. Companies were bidding on that with a great deal of hope that they would, of course, get the multi-billion-dollar project that recently was completed. But as I understand it, there is some discussion about settling shortfalls in, you know, the companies realizing a profit that should be fair for doing such a grand project. Now, that money was, as I understand it, specifically earmarked for that, if we can use that term, earmarked. A lot of this other money, and it hasn't been made very explicit where the money is coming from, but in a normal year, and I suspect with this infrastructure money we're talking about it, and I'm talking mainly about highways and bridges, the traditional hard infrastructure, and I think that's what you were alluding to too, in part at least. That comes from what is called the Highway Trust Fund.
Right, where the gas tax.
The gas tax, exactly.
Yeah, the one that
I suspect that
1894, right?
That's right. It was 18.4 cents a gallon then, I think, and today it's 18.4 cents a gallon. But there are always caveats when we're talking about budgets, when we're talking about the government, when we're talking about anything that comes out of Washington. That 18.4 cents a gallon, if you go to your pump, if you can find it, a breakdown of why you're paying $3.50 or $4 a gallon, that 18.4 cents is a small part of it. There are also state taxes and sometimes municipal taxes. So that could be 2, 3, 4 times the 18 cents a gallon. So it makes up a pretty good chunk. Now, in recent years, recent almost decades, that Highway Trust Fund has been close to zero for a variety of reasons. One is electric cars. By promoting electric cars, the government is taking away incentive to have an internal combustion engine, which means they're taking away the incentive to buy gasoline, or the need even to buy gasoline, and therefore not contribute to the Highway Trust Fund through the gas tax. Another reason is there have been pressures from the Environmental Protection Agency, another government agency, to increase the mileage per gallon that automobiles get. Well, of course, if you drive the same amount, and most people do tend to drive roughly the same from year to year, they're going to use less gas, and therefore they're going to pay less tax, and they're going to contribute less to the fund. So for a variety of reasons, and especially recently with the pandemic, there's been less driving for a variety of reasons. So this trust fund is no longer very viable. What's going to happen? How is it going to change? Well, Congress could contribute more to, basically infuse money into it, as they do with a lot of other things in the economy. And they had been doing that to the tune of billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars a year for some time. But, there comes a point at which that becomes intractable. So they're looking to, and this is part of the infrastructure bill that's going on in Washington now, but it's not much talked about, and that is, what are we going to do about raising money to fix our infrastructure or maintain it, and to add new infrastructure, build new things? How are we going to raise that revenue from those who use the roads and bridges and other aspects of infrastructure? So if we don't have a gas tax that's effective, and it's with increasing numbers of electric and hybrid vehicles, there's no expectation that it's going to increase significantly. There's a new thing, and in the budget, I believe, if it maintains all the debate that's going on in Washington, is money to conduct, I guess they're called trials or proof of ability.
Proof of concept.
Proof of concept, exactly. Thank you very much. It's escaped my mind. But yes, so, and the concept is that you pay for the miles you drive on the roads rather than the gas you buy to drive on the roads. So this takes it away from
Oregon, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oregon has been doing this for some years, and they've been doing it rather successfully. I have anecdotal evidence only, talking to people who've been under that system, and they find it reasonable. But it's going to expand.
GPS don't. They don't track you. They track the miles. Like, you put a GPS on your car, right? And they track the miles, but not where you go, to address kind of the privacy issue of it, is what I recommend.
Yeah, well, that is one of the reasons people object to it. Whether these proof of concept experiments will do that or not, maybe, I don't know what they're trying to prove. That depends on the concept, of course, and the concept could be to understand more about driving habits. I can't speak to that with any knowledge.
Right,
but,
right. How do you get credit for this? If you get
it is coming.
But so do you pay the tax? How do you pay it? It might seems like you go to the pump,
don't call it a tax
or something. Is that right?
They don't call it a tax.
Oh,
they call it a user fee.
Right.
So when we hear there are no new taxes, that's why that statement can be uttered by politicians.
Sure.
This is not a tax, it's a fee. Well, it's a fee. They don't even call it a toll. They call it a fee. Of course, it's very much like, well, you have Easy Pass up there. I drive up and down the East Coast fairly often, and I have an Easy Pass too. And you can drive through at speed, bypass the toll booths, and you look over and say, why are those people waiting to pay their toll? It's so convenient to just pass through with Easy Pass. I have no idea whether they're tracking me or not. And I don't honestly care, because I don't think I'm doing anything wrong.
Right.
So So that's not a concern of mine. So I can't really speak to that, why people might object to that. How
Yeah,
it's paid for is probably going to be, and this is again what is the concept going to be? The way I pay for Easy Pass now is I deposit a certain amount, and I have credit that I use up every time I go past an Easy Pass detector, and they notify me when my balance is getting low, and I add more to it. And those are ways that can be done. The people in Oregon that have told me they think it's a reasonable system. They get a statement every month showing their activity in detail, and they seem to like that quite a bit. So you could say that's keeping the system honest, and it's not like they're just taking money out of your account without explanation.
yeah. How, I'm curious how you came to do this book, your 19th book. And I noticed that you had written a book about bridges. Did that lead to roads? It's kind of a chicken or the egg question, which came first, the bridges or the roads? But did the bridge book kind of lead you to look more into roads and that kind of thing that took you to the topic?
I hadn't thought of it that way because I wrote the bridge book quite a few years, maybe 20 years before I wrote the infrastructure book. Is that there was a great deal of talk about infrastructure, and I'm a member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, and every 4 years they issue a report card on the infrastructure. So I see a lot in the literature I read about that, and it just seemed like an idea that well, I wanted to know more about. Many of the books I write are for my edification. I have to do the research, and therefore I learn about the issues.
Yeah.
It's a very enjoyable process to tell you the truth. It's self-education, and it's communication with the public at the same time. So I would say that there wasn't any grand plan, but it just seemed like the time to write that. This report card that the American Society of Civil Engineers issues, by the way, is timed for a new administration coming in. So that's why it's every 4 years. They
Okay.
deliberately want to try to influence the fact that the government should fund, and not only roads and bridges. It has in there typically water supply, help, the quality of the water supply, uh, inland waterways, how barge traffic travels in the Midwest, for example, up the Mississippi, and they worry about pollution. These are all these categories. Uh, so infrastructure to the civil engineering community, at least, means a lot more than just roads and bridges. Uh, we have in my department, for example, we have courses in transportation. We have courses in environmental engineering. What do you do with waste? How do you minimize waste and pollution? Make sure the effluents are not toxic, and if they are, how do you clean them up? These are all aspects of civil engineering and infrastructure.
Well, we had started out by talking about the Tappan Zee, and I did enjoy. I learned quite a bit from the book, not having known the history of it. But two things I wanted to ask if you might just address, and one is why they built it where they did on this widest part of the river, which doesn't seem to make any sense. And then two, you taught me about, what was the term, fracture critical bridge building, which I thought was interesting. I wonder if you could just talk about those two topics
Sure,
related.
those are right. Those are excellent questions and topics.
Mhm.
And the answer to the first one, why they built it at the widest part of the river, um, is the answer to a lot of things in infrastructure. It's money and tolls and tax and income. New York City, there's the Port Authority of New York. It used to be called the Port of New York Authority. More recently, it's the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And if you draw a circle centered at the Statue of Liberty for 25 miles, that Port Authority controls everything within those 25 miles. bridges, airports, ferries, and so forth. And by controlling it, that means any tolls that are collected at those points go to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So it was built at Tappan Zee. If you look at a map that gives you distances or measure it from the Statue of Liberty, that's just outside that 25-mile circle. So it was built there for very special and selfish reasons, and it had to do with a lot of lobbying and making sure that you didn't step on the wrong side of the border with the footprint of the bridge. That's pretty much it. You're right. But you normally don't build a bridge at the narrowest point at the widest point of a river, in large part because you have to have a lot more support piers in the river. Now, of course, this is where engineering and infrastructure gets complicated. If a river is wide, that means it's also narrow at that point. Shallow at that point, which means it's not very difficult to build a lot of piers. And if you go over the Tappan Zee Bridge, you notice that except for that main span that is a cable stayed span, those other spans I forget the exact distance, but a couple hundred feet probably, you go over a little bump, or at least it used to be. I haven't been on the new one yet, but on the old one, you would be bump, 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 because you're going over the joints that are over the supports. When you have a very narrow part in the river's deep, and it's very expensive to put up towers, let's say, or supports. So you put as few as you can. And you sort of balance these things out and you decide which is feasible, which is affordable, which is the preferred and best solution. Now, as far as your yes.
Oh, I was going to say we have the Bear Mountain Bridge as well, which is really a narrow place in the river, so you see the juxtaposition of that.
Right. That's a suspension bridge. That's
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
and also
seemed inefficient. When you say
now,
when we were talking about the fracture critical, right? Is that the right term?
Yes, right. Well, the old bridge that crossed the Tappan, if you recall, that was a steel bridge with a lot of beams and columns going every which way. That's called a truss bridge, technically. And the one at Tappan Zee in particular was what is called a cantilever bridge, which means they can build it stretched out from one end and also from the other end, and they meet at the middle there, and they support themselves in a lever system, cantilever. If in those bridges, if one part of them breaks, a critical part that allows everything else to collapse, that's what's called fracture critical. Usually, it's associated with say some cracking developing in the steel, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. Every time a vehicle goes over a bridge, it flexes the bridge a little bit. If it's a light vehicle, you probably won't feel it, but if it's a heavy vehicle like a very big truck, you will feel it a great deal. And every time that happens, the steel gets bent a little bit. So it gets bent, it gets unbent, and so forth. And that leads to the development of cracks if it goes on for a sufficient amount of time, and if the original steel design was not sufficiently robust. This happens in airplanes too, by the way, another aspect of infrastructure. Every time an airplane goes up, it gets pressurized, it's unpressurized, and sometimes the crack is the same reason. So that's fracture critical. If one thing goes, the whole thing goes. That's pretty much that term in a nutshell.
But do they design? I mean, this kind of goes back to your first book. The idea that failure teaches us something, but do they design it that way on purpose, or what? Wouldn't you not design it?
Yes. Yeah. No. everything has a breaking point. That's a given, um, including people.
Yeah.
uh, so then people have sometimes grander ideas than they should, and they get overconfident in the designs, and they believe that they understand exactly how they can fail, and therefore they think, well, because they understand that, they can build them in this way, and that works up to a point. But what kicks in then is a human hubris, and they say, well, this worked. Let's build a bigger one, and we can do it the same way because this smaller one worked. And this goes on over perhaps decades, and you get to a point where you've built it too big. And this is a phenomenon that has existed in civilization for millennia, literally. Um, some of the oldest books on engineering talk about it. Galileo, for example, who wrote back the 17th century. That's how he started. One of his books was "These Things Are Breaking," and he was talking about stone monuments like obelisks and columns. And he said, "Why do they break? If we knew how they break, we might know how to keep them from breaking." And he went on to develop a system of figuring out how you could tell in advance how something breaks. And engineers follow pretty much that method today. So they think they know when it's going to fail. And what they forget is this problem of increasingly relying on that without regard to how big something is. So it's not all just technical. There's a lot of human nature involved
Yeah.
in engineering. That's partly the idea of my title, "To Engineer as Human."
Yeah. How do they, I mean, so when they build a bridge, do they do they say this is going to last 50 years? This is going to last 100 years? I mean, do they rate it that way
Yes,
or something?
yes, they do. They
Okay.
do. And the reason they do is precisely for what we've been talking about, fatigue. They know that if it develops cracks, they're going to grow at a certain rate. And uh, that is, after 50 years, it's going to be critical and it'll break. The A bridge like the Tappan Zee, now the Tappan Zee maybe is not the best example because it uh, is a replacement. So they knew a lot about the traffic and so forth. But a bridge before, let's say before the Tappan Zee that was there, let's say they're going to decide to build a bridge, make an argument for that, that who's going to pay for it? That's always the big infrastructure problem. So part of the, let's say the preliminary engineering is to figure out, well, how many cars and trucks are going to use this bridge per day? How many how much are we going to charge those cars and trucks to use the bridge? Uh, how much revenue will that be? And what kind of bridge will that buy? And this has been done. This is literally how, say, the George Washington Bridge was rationalized, the Golden Gate Bridge, and all the big infrastructure projects, and not just bridges, but tunnels and anything you pay a toll for, let's say, or anything a municipal entity that has a fixed budget has to consider. So that's how, and then you go and you try to design it technically after you've decided that it's, um, economically viable. You've made that decision. And designing it technically then couples with this idea of fracture and crack growth and fatigue and fracture critical, and therefore the length of the time limit on the bridge. And that was the argument given for tearing or replacing the old Tappan Zee Bridge. It was reaching its lifetime, and it's exactly what you said, that it's designed to last only so many years.
Yeah. It's interesting. You pointed out in the book too, this weird relationship that the federal government has with infrastructure, where it always ends up being the local guys who have to rebuild everything. As far as the
Yes,
money,
that's it.
you know.
Yeah, well, the The U.S. Constitution doesn't authorize the federal government to own bridges or roads, infrastructure like that. And the federal government does have this highway trust funds. They collect the taxes, but they can't do anything with it themselves other than distribute it to the states. And then that gets into politics. How much do you give to each state? Well, you can
Right.
figure out formulas. How much are they paying in? And states are always complaining, well, we pay in more than we get, or those that get more than they pay in don't complain, of course. So there can be, favoritism, and depending on what party's in office and so forth. So it really is the states or the local counties or the local municipalities that get the money from the government, federal government, and spend it, and therefore do have a certain responsibility, because it's up to them to know how much they need to accomplish certain tasks. The interstate highway system, for example, and the interstate highway, of course, goes over the Tappan Zee. When that was started up in the Eisenhower administration back in the 1950s, the federal government, was offering to pay 90% of the cost of what it would cost the state to build their section of the interstate, because they had to be motivated, because they knew they would be, stuck not only with a big bill for building these sections of interstate, but also maintaining them. Maintenance is not the glamorous part of infrastructure.
Yeah.
The politicians don't run around saying, "Oh, we're going to start a resurfacing project. Let's get on TV and announce it." Maintenance is just not glamorous. So
No.
it's only the new buildings and bridges that they want to have their face associated with.
Did they justify the highway system by saying it was for the military? I mean, or something about it allowed them to get move the military around the country, or that.
That's often been said. I don't think that was the primary motivation. There
Yeah.
was talk about an interstate highway system from the 20s and 30s, when the automobile began to really grow in numbers. That'd be the 20s. It was obvious that the roads were not sufficient. In fact, I think it was around 1920, a few years before 1920, that the Army did want to see if they could get their material from the East Coast to the West Coast by land, rather than by going by ship through the Panama Canal and so forth. And they assembled a convoy, and Dwight Eisenhower, who wasn't a general or a politician at that point, was among those. And they experienced quite a bit of difficulty in going from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. I think it took them a couple of months. If I had to check the numbers, I don't remember exactly how, but it's not 3 days.
Yeah, a lot of photos of stuck in the mud. And
stuck in the mud, exactly. And how did they get out of the mud? Well, they had horses pull them out. So the old infrastructure doesn't exactly become obsolete. It can be very important for helping new infrastructure get out of the mud. Let's put it that way.
Are you hopeful about infrastructure where it's? I mean, are we going to fix all this stuff that's crumbling from the 50s? I mean, essentially, it's our time, our generation, right? Has to do the next big build.
It's been fixed all along. If you drive, as I say, I drive along I-95 up and down the East Coast. I used to do it every summer. They were constantly having road projects, men working and so forth, signs. They'd be widening it here or there because there was more traffic than had been. Some places they were adding, widening bridges. That all costs money, and that's maintenance and upkeep. So that's been happening since the interstate highway system was in place. And the states ask for money for that, just like they do for a new project. And it's all very competitive. Usually the states follow this stuff pretty closely, so that when money does become available, they know how much to ask for, and they know what they're going to do with it pretty much.
Yeah, I talked to Congressman Maloney, Sean Patrick Maloney's our congressman here, and he said one aspect of the bill that was important, that the funding was going to go over 5 years so that states could plan. They would know the money would be there next year and the year after that, so they could hopefully go beyond maintenance and kind of, replace smaller bridges or whatever, which I thought was interesting. So there wouldn't just be maintenance. In fact, people seem to be afraid of that it's just going to be kind of disappear into maintenance rather than fixing.
Well, everything has to be maintained. We have to maintain our bodies if we want to last for our design lifetime.
Yeah.
Not everything wears out, and maintenance is a very important factor. I once saw some figures from an insurance company. To build a new bridge or a new building, that of course is a capital investment. But to maintain that same building or bridge was then, and this is many years ago, it's just a number I remember, was 4% per year.
Wow.
So after 25 years, you have to spend in maintenance the cost of the piece of infrastructure. That of course doesn't account for inflation. So it's very misleading when things are priced at just the cost to build them. Maintenance is a very important thing.
Well, that's
my university. Yeah.
That's the hard lesson for the new homeowner, isn't it?
Oh, of course. Yes. Yes, it is. Yes. If you live in an apartment, you call up the landlord, and
yeah,
that's But when you're on your own, you're on your own. Homeowners tend to understand maintenance. They realize that, well, you could neglect it. You don't have to do it. Nobody's twisting your arm. Your insurance company might have something to say with it about it, but if you do not do it, your house is going to, well, eventually it would collapse around you. You drive around rural areas and you see collapsing barns. Why? Well, they haven't been maintained. They allow water to leak through roofs, and that rots wood and everything like that.
Yeah, your view of water changes as a homeowner. It seems so natural and beautiful, and then you become a homeowner, and you're like, it destroys
enemy, huh?
It destroys everything.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you. We've gone on a long time. I appreciate the time, and I would recommend the book, "The Road Taken: The History and Future of America's Infrastructure." Are you writing a new book? Are you working on a new book?
I have one in production now. I expect to get some manuscript back next week that I have to correct.
Oh, what is the topic? Can you reveal the topic?
It's about how we feel the forces that act on structures. I want to bring it down to a human level. How do we? What kind of forces are involved when we want to push something up a hill, or when we want to stop something from rolling down a hill, or what are the forces involved when we just want to walk? And why is it different walking on, let's say, an icy pavement rather than a dry pavement?
Oh, that's great.
So the title of the book is "In Touch with the Universe," and I deal with a lot of very common situations, and also some very monumental situations in which the interaction of people and these inanimate pieces of infrastructure and inanimate objects generally that we interact with every day, how that relationship is, how our relationship is with the non-living world, let's say.
Well, I will say that your books are good because you're a great writer, and so the concepts, you make the concepts very easy to understand. That's what I like about them. And I thought The Road Taken was that way. In fact, my favorite chapter, I believe, is really how roads are made, the asphalt versus concrete, dilemma, which is like a cat versus dog argument, I think. And then so reporter Mike Turton and I went last week to the local asphalt company, and I felt well educated as he explained how asphalt was made, because I had read the background. I was like, of course. Then you mix this in, and but it was one of those things you don't think about, right? They come into your driveway. Where's this stuff come from? And so I think it was really interesting just to have that kind of background going into it. So, well, thank you so much. I appreciate the time, and we'll see what happens with the Congress. If they can get that money sent out. I don't know. So, well, thank you again.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.